Hi there, my name is Jared Johnson, and for my Psych 400 project, I am focusing on Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, being born and raised in Oak Park, Illinois, in 1902 to Walter Rogers and Julia Rogers. He was the fourth of six siblings and the youngest sibling for only a span of about 4 years. His family were extremely conservative and Protestant, having main values being focused around hard work and anything innately pleasurable, albeit smoking, dancing, drinking, other activities, were innately and inherently sinful. For his parents' careers, Walter was a successful civil engineer, owning his own successful company in construction. Julie, on the other hand, was a stay-at-home mom, a housewife, and a devout Christian. At age 12, though, Carl and his family moved further away from the main Chicago suburbs, mostly to follow their Protestant ideals of getting the family away from these evils of suburbia. Here they had a 300-acre farm where Carl finally found his love for sciences, with him and his brothers playing around with seeds on the farm and running just experiments specifically in agricultural science. As for Carl's educational background, this love for agriculture led him to want to follow in his father's footsteps and his brothers and go attend University of Wisconsin with a focus in agriculture. Here, the world of college was an entire new world for Carl Rogers. It gave him a full new perspective of people, ideas, and mindsets. Carl was a young, sheltered child with his family, so college was a whole new world for him. Eventually, while here, he changed his course from agriculture into history because he developed the mindset of wanting to become a minister, which pushed him to go to New York's Theological Seminary after his graduation from University of Wisconsin in 1924. This formal education continued on here in New York City. The seminary, they were very liberal Protestant. To his family's dismay, they were very unhappy about this. While here in New York, Carl also took psychology and psychiatry classes from the Columbia University's Teachers College on the side. As for prominent professors, mentors, and people in Carl Rogers' life, there weren't too many listed. Obviously, all the main people he followed for theorists are in there: Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, all very prominent in building to his person-centered therapy. But specifically, John Dewey, a philosopher, was a major influence on him. John Dewey helping him gain the idea that experience is the basis of learning. Side on top of that, William Kilpatrick, a student of Dewey's, even gave more influence in his lectures heard by Carl Rogers of the person-centered approach. This pushing that experience, again, very key to learning, but also empathetic approaches in creating a bond with like a person as a key. One final major influence for Carl Rogers was Otto Rank. He also was a heavy influence in Carl Rogers' work. They both were big advocates for a patient or person-centered treatment. The only difference between the two, Otto Rank tended to prefer in treatment having it be emotionally involved with a person, but then pushing them into creative outlets, artistic creativity in their therapy, while Carl Rogers, on the other hand, pushed for creating a therapeutic alliance and close bond in order to help a client in their therapeutic efforts. As for the degrees for Carl Rogers, as before I stated, he had a Master of Arts in Psychology and a PhD in Clinical Psych, and that on top of his undergrad degrees of History and Religion, pushing him into there. Other slight influences that Carl Rogers was likely to have and impacts on him are informally, like I mentioned before, the growing up on the farm, learning about nature's and its inevitability and its strength as it grows. And he also did have, in 1920, while still at University of Wisconsin, a big school trip to China, actually. Here, it was a very self-liberating trip. He got to experience a lot of new things again, even more so from his time at the university. This causing more questioning to go on in his life, more seeing people and interacting with new people and attempting to understand what they are going through. As for Carl Rogers' careers, he was nearly always at some kind of university, especially after college. So it's pretty straightforward in this. Starting at 1928 to 1940, he was a staff member, eventually turned director at the New York Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children and the Child Study Center, both of these being out of Rochester, New York. After there, from 1940 to 1944, he was a professor for clinical psychology at Ohio State University. Then, for a span of a year after that, to 1945, he worked at the United Services Organization, helping console and talk to retired servicemen. From 1945 to 1957, he worked at the University of Chicago, where he actually was allowed to establish a counseling center. And then for a short period in this time, for the year of 1947, he was actually elected president of the American Psychological Association. After this, from 1957 to 1963, he worked at the University of Wisconsin, just teaching psychology, and then from 1963 to his death in 1968, he was in California at the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute, before eventually leaving that to help establish the Career for Studies of the Person, which is actually going on its 50th anniversary this year too. As for major contributions from Carl Rogers, there are so many to talk about, but I'm going to focus on two main things, one a lot lesser than the other. The first one is his concept of the fully functioning person, and second being his whole person-centered approach for therapy. That one's going to have a lot more meat to it, but to start off, the fully functioning person, this is Carl Rogers' idea of what a person should have in their qualities and traits to actually be a fully functioning person. It's decently self-explanatory. You can also think of it in Maslow's like triangle, his hierarchy of needs. It is the top of the pillar. If you have this, you're going to be a lot more psychologically sound and, like it says, functioning. Carl Rogers, in his description of this fully functioning person, describes it as someone with openness to experience, living with a sense of meaning and purpose, trust and congruence with oneself, an undoubting positive self-regard to self and to others, along with an internal locus of evaluation and being fully aware in the moment while living creatively. These things are going to push people to have that full, free life full of experience and not be hindered by outside stimuli compared to someone who is not open to new things, living without meaning, for example. First, the main 6 conditions laid out by Carl Rogers. Then I will have some quick descriptions on things like congruence, unconditional positive regard, empathy, and non-directiveness in this. To start off, again, those 6 conditions laid out by him. This is 6 conditions needed to have a therapeutic alliance with a client. The main biggest thing for this idea because this therapeutic alliance is what is going to help the person grow with your empathy and everything. To start, a relationship must exist. The two people have to be in psychological contact. 2, the client is in a state of incongruence, which causes him or her to be vulnerable or anxious. 3, the therapist is congruent. You have to be genuine and authentic in your relationship, actually. 4, the therapist experiences unconditional positive regard for the client, as I will explain later again. And then 5, the therapist experiences and attempts to express an empathetic understanding of the client's internal frame of reference. This again stated later also. And then 6, the therapist's unconditional positive regard, empathetic understanding, and congruence must all be perceived by the client, at least to some degree. They have to believe and feel that you are being empathetic, congruent, and actually care about what is going on in your sessions. As I was stating before, I have to describe some of these terms. To start off, he has this idea of congruence. Congruence being the ability from the therapist or counselor to be genuine and authentic in their discussions, making openness, sensitivity, and a large amount of self-awareness key to this. They have to be able to give signals and signs that are clear and consistent to your client. Without these, they might get a mix-up of your inner and outer self. And you want, like I said, that congruence, same inner self as outer self being shown to the client. This congruence being shown through everything: body language, thoughts, communications, and they all have to be real and genuine for this therapy to work out. These things do cause some issues, as congruence here, when looked at from psychoanalysis, such as Freud, it is seen as transference or countertransference between a therapist and client. Rogers took a slightly different approach, that it was a thinner line for this countertransference there. This emotion expressiveness helps actually create empathy for the client, and the client creating a better bond between the therapist and client. Up next is the unconditional positive regard, which again explains itself to a decent amount. It is that the therapist is everything: caring, respecting, liking, and being accepting of people for who they are. No pre-existing notions of the client should influence how they have to act, feel, or think in this situation. Another big trait with this is making sure you do not attribute things to a person's character, and you look at them within the context. For example, if someone's angry, you tell them that they are not an angry person. You say they seem to be angry in this situation because of what you believe to be going on. You're not attributing a feeling to a person as a always thing, but as a part of them in this context. The next emphasis from Carl Rogers is empathy. Empathy here being defined by him also in the 1980s as temporary living in another's life, moving about it delicately without making judgments. It also means sensing meanings of what he or she is scarcely aware, but not trying to uncover totally unconscious feelings. Again, this isn't psychoanalysis, this is the person-centered therapy, because something like that would be much too threatening for a person to experience. But then on top of this, he also says it also means frequently checking with the person to make sure you are accurately attributing what you are sensing and expressing what you are sensing. This again is a very fine line. You do not want to say you've experienced exactly what it is like to be in the client's shoes, and you do not want to say you are sorry. Sympathy is going to create a gap between situations, Empathy, if it's too great, it is going to cause a tearing there because you haven't experienced exactly what your client has. Nothing exactly in their context. There's always slight differences, so you have to be careful, truly empathetic, and genuine in your feelings, just not exactly what they've experienced and not feeling sympathy as in sorriness. The final thing to describe here is the non-directiveness. This being a non-manipulative concept when you are with your client. For the client, you do not want to manipulate them, but they also cannot be just a passive recipient from what you are saying. Non-directiveness focuses on a client's growth as a person and with themselves as the main focus, albeit complete non-directiveness is nearly impossible, stated by Rogers. It can come close, but there will always be bias from questions asked, your empathetic responses. But ideally, the main focus of person-centered therapy is a client grows on their own in order to better themselves, and you do not push them too heavily in your therapy. For goals of person-centered therapy, therapeutic-wise with your clinician, they want to be able to have the client express trust and have confidence in their abilities with the current and present moment, this leading to the honesty and trust building with the clinician, so it is easier to share all emotions and thoughts between each other in order to promote growth, again, of the client. Other sub-goals that come from this, as discussed in non-directiveness, any growth internally from the client is a goal from this treatment. Things like self-awareness, empowerment, responsibility, autonomy, or optimism are all also sub-goals from the end result of treatment of the person-centered therapy. The final section I have here to discuss is current critiques of Carl Rogers. So some external critiques that I have for his main theory and him of the person-centered therapy is there are some downsides to it. Biggest potential issues with it, culture and expressivity of emotions can be a very big hindrance, as many cultures do not express emotions in the same way and light that much Western culture does. Some upside to this, though, if you are aware of other cultures and how they express emotions, you can find workarounds with this or slowly work them into it. But that is one major downside. The other only issue for limitation for this is that it is not very direct and that it takes an immense amount of time and training to develop many of these skills. The non-directiveness of this, the non-direct approach of person-centered therapy from Carl Rogers, again, may not sit well with many clients. It is a very stark contrast from other behavioral analysis type of things or Freudian psychoanalysis, where a counselor will tell you issues and you will need to fix them. Person-centered therapy very much develops through growth of the client, as I stated, so it is very ambiguous in its discussion, and again, non-directiveness is a key aspect of this, so you do not have a clinician telling a client what to do. For the time and teaching of this type of therapy, it takes a lot from the counselor themselves and them going through teaching with it. The counselor has to be all things to the client, as stated before, genuine, self-actualized, present, focused, patient, non-judgmental, especially empathetic, again, congruent on all levels. This taking a lot from a counselor, empathy also being very draining on a lot of people, will take a big toll on the counselor. But them developing these skills also can take a lot of training, being very intensive on the requirements to practice this therapy. One other quick mention that I wanted to say for Carl Rogers is there was a recent study from Stephen Hagblum that did find Carl Rogers as the 6th most famous and respected psychologist based on things like citations and recognition. This being very big because the top 6 is very great, but then as a clinician, he was second only to Freud, one of the biggest names within psychology, showing and showcasing how influential his new theory has been, even with all the other background of options, this leading to so many new growth and development for counseling and therapy. As a final note, my thoughts on Carl Rogers and his influences with things like person-centered therapy. I clearly chose Carl Rogers for a reason with this project. I was in the Theories of Counseling class last semester, and sadly we did not really get to focus on Carl Rogers, and I was never able to be tested on him. I did have plenty of notes still taken from the book on him that did help a lot with this, and just knowledge on him. Being Wisconsin born, the growing up on the farm, big influences towards me with it. I understand many of those things. And me wanting to go into psychology and feeling very same or similar to many of his approaches, the empathy, and how I would do many of these type of things with friends in little counseling sessions I'd have with them, just helping them with day-to-day problems. I very much grabbed on to this therapy and this idea and would like to further in that, so that is why I am very influenced by him and his ideas, and I do think it is one of the best ways to create a bond between client and clinician. As for that bond between client and clinician, I feel this type of therapy will help the client most and the clinician both in their growth. It is something that takes both of them working, and in the end I feel like this therapy is very high up there on the list of the highest quality ones for the patient, focusing on their growth and, like his goals before, being autonomous, being optimistic, having just that ability to grow on their own so they don't ever feel a need to come back to a thing like therapy. That is why I feel like this is going to last many, many years with this type of therapy. It makes a lot of sense, and it's nice that Carl Rogers condensed it all into an actual therapeutic science, and it's very long-lived, I feel like, and will have a big place within therapy for as long as you can have therapy and a client-clinician bond in there.